Do you remember those cheap dishes black mothers made that kids begged for back in the 60s? In kitchens that had more love than money, those meals filled bellies, warmed hearts, and held families together. How did something born from struggle end up tasting so much like home? Smothered neck bones with rice was more than dinner. It was an experience, the kind that started early in the morning with the sound of sizzling oil and the smell of seasoned meat filling the whole house. Black mothers knew exactly how to make the cheapest cuts feel like royalty. Neck bones came from the part of the pig or cow that nobody else wanted, but in the right hands, they became tender gold. After being browned in a cast iron pan, they were left to simmer low and slow in onion gravy until the meat nearly fell off the bone. The rice stretched the meal, soaking up every drop of flavor like a promise that nobody would go hungry. By the time it hit the table, kids were already lined up, plates in hand, because this was the kind of meal that called the family together without a word. It was rich, humble, and soulful all at once, proof that flavor had nothing to do with money and everything to do with patience. This dish turned struggle into comfort, poverty into pride, and the simplest ingredients into something sacred. Every bite tasted like home and hard work mixed in the same pot. Hot water cornbread was the taste of love born from simplicity. There was nothing fancy about it, just cornmeal, a pinch of salt, and boiling water stirred until thick enough to pat into little cakes. But when those golden rounds hit hot oil in the skillet, they transformed into something unforgettable. The edges crisped, the center stayed soft, and the sound of frying filled the air like a hymn. Black mothers made it by instinct, no measuring cups, just memory and rhythm passed down from the generations before them. It was the perfect side for beans, greens, or anything with gravy. Kids loved grabbing one straight from the pan, too hot to hold but too good to wait for. It crackled when bitten, leaving that warm, toasty flavor that only cast iron can give. In those kitchens, hot water cornbread meant more than food. It was family survival turned into comfort. It stretched meals when flour was scarce, but somehow always tasted like abundance. For families with little, it was proof that little was enough. If childhood had a smell for many kids in the 1960s, it was fried bologna. That familiar sizzle of meat hitting the skillet was the sign that lunch was handled, even if the fridge looked empty. Black mothers could turn a 50-cent pack of bologna into pure joy. The edges would curl into little cups as the fat rendered down, giving that perfect crisp that made it taste better than steak. A slice of white bread, a smear of mustard or mayonnaise, maybe a tomato if you were lucky. That was it. And somehow, that simple sandwich filled bellies and hearts alike. Mothers called it a quick fix, but for kids, it was comfort food in its truest form. It was eaten standing up, sitting on porches, or running out the door to play, and every bite felt like love on a budget. Bologna was cheap, but what came from it was priceless. A moment of flavor, family, and fun that outlasted the hunger it cured. In times when money was short, flavor never was. Red beans and rice was the heartbeat of Sunday kitchens. A pot bubbling slow on the stove all afternoon, while laughter, church clothes, and gospel music filled the background. It came from New Orleans but lived in every black household that knew how to stretch one meal into three. Mothers started with dried beans, soaked overnight and flavored with what little meat was left from the week. A ham bone, a sausage piece, or maybe just a pinch of seasoning salt. The smell alone could feed the soul. When poured over rice, it became something rich, creamy, and comforting, every bite carrying the weight of history and home. Kids begged for seconds because it never tasted the same twice. Each pot had its own rhythm, its own story. Red beans and rice didn't just fill bellies. It reminded families that food could bring joy even in lean times. It was a dish that spoke the language of patience, pride, and peace after a long week. Macaroni and cheese with evaporated milk was the crown jewel of comfort food. It was creamy, baked golden brown on top, and made with ingredients that every family could afford: macaroni, cheese, butter, and a can of evaporated milk. That milk was the secret weapon, turning basic noodles into something silky and rich. Mothers would mix it up by hand, sprinkle breadcrumbs or shredded cheese on top, and bake it until the house smelled like heaven. On Sunday tables, it stood proud next to fried chicken and collard greens, and you could always count on kids scraping the sides of the pan for the crispy bits. It wasn't fancy cheese or fancy cookware. It was heart and patience that made it special. Every forkful carried the taste of warmth and love, something only homemade food can give. For a generation that grew up with little, this dish was proof that care could make any meal extraordinary. There was magic in a pot of pinto beans with fatback. The beans started hard and pale, but after hours of simmering, they turned soft, smoky, and full of flavor. That piece of fatback, salty, greasy, and rich, was the key. It turned plain beans into something families looked forward to all week. Mothers knew just how long to let it cook, letting the smell drift through the house, making everyone hungry before dinner even started. Served with rice or cornbread, it filled bellies without emptying pockets. It was the kind of meal that reminded everyone that slow food was soul food. Pinto beans weren't about luxury. They were about making do and making it delicious. When you sat down to that bowl, you didn't just taste beans. You tasted strength, creativity, and the rhythm of home. Collard greens with ham hocks was the smell of Sunday and the sound of family. The greens started tough, but once they simmered down with smoked meat and onions, they turned soft, flavorful, and rich. The ham hock gave that deep, savory base that stretched into the broth, what everyone called potlikker. Mothers made big pots of it because nobody could stop at one serving. The meal was simple but carried tradition, passed from hands that had worked the land and learned how to make flavor from scraps. A plate of greens next to cornbread and rice could feed you body and soul. The bitterness of the greens mixed with the salt of the meat in perfect harmony, and that first bite was always worth the wait. In the 1960s, this wasn't just dinner. It was history simmered to perfection. Candied yams were the sweetest thing to ever come out of a humble kitchen. Peeled, sliced, and baked with butter, sugar, and just a hint of cinnamon, they turned into a caramel-colored dream. On Sundays or holidays, you could bet the smell alone had kids running to the table. Black mothers knew how to make them shine, rich enough to feel like dessert, but served proudly beside collard greens or fried chicken. They didn't need marshmallows or fancy toppings, just patience and love. The syrup would bubble, the edges would crisp, and by the time the pan came out, it looked like gold. Even families who had little found a way to make this dish, because sweetness was a necessity, not a luxury. Candied yams reminded everyone that joy could still be baked right alongside struggle. Molasses coffee was not fancy, but it was strong enough to keep a person going through the longest of days. When coffee beans were scarce and sugar even scarcer, someone clever discovered that a spoonful of blackstrap molasses stirred into hot water or weak brew could make a drink both sweet and smoky. The result was thick and dark, with a bitterness that clung to the tongue and warmed the chest. It tasted like work and resilience, like fields at sunrise and factory bells ringing. Families drank it early and often, some adding milk if fortune allowed, others taking it plain with bread crusts for breakfast. It was a poor man's luxury, a small rebellion against hunger and fatigue. The smell alone was enough to wake the tired and remind them that strength could be stirred, not bought. Molasses coffee was courage in a cup, shared by hands cracked from labor and hearts that refused to quit. It carried the spirit of people who built their mornings out of willpower and steam, proving that dignity could live even in the thinnest brew. Cowpea soup simmered like a prayer whispered over a fire. The pot would start with water, a scoop of dried field peas, and maybe a scrap of salted meat if the week had been kind. Onions and garlic joined in, releasing their scent as the broth thickened into something golden and strong. The cowpeas, small and sturdy, softened slowly, their flavor deepening with every hour. This wasn't fast food, it was patient food, built on rhythm and time. Families made it during harvest, when work was hard and hands needed warmth. It was ladled into tin bowls and passed around without ceremony, each bite grounding you in gratitude. Sometimes cornbread floated on top like an offering, soaking up the last drops of broth. The soup tasted of earth and labor, of simple things done well. Cowpea soup was both meal and memory, tying together generations who had learned how to make plenty out of little. It was food for body and spirit alike, humble but whole, strong but soothing. Even now, its scent carries the same promise, that comfort comes from what you give, not what you have. Chitlins' holiday feast once marked winter celebrations with an aroma as unforgettable as the labor required to prepare it. Hog intestines were cleaned thoroughly, then simmered for hours with onions, vinegar, and spices until tender. The dish demanded patience and community, often bringing families together for a full day of washing and cooking. Served with hot sauce and cornbread, chitlins carried the history of using every part of the animal, a practice born of necessity during slavery and carried forward as a mark of resilience. Despite the strong scent that filled kitchens and neighborhoods, the feast represented abundance and pride, especially during Christmas and New Year gatherings. Elders spoke of the old days while younger generations learned the careful methods required to make the dish safe and flavorful. In many places, health concerns and changing tastes have pushed chitlins aside, but the tradition still holds a powerful place in memory as a symbol of perseverance and celebration. Hog maw and potatoes was a dish that turned thrift into comfort and labor into flavor. Hog maw, the lining of a pig's stomach, was scrubbed clean, seasoned, and stuffed with diced potatoes, onions, and spices before being boiled to tenderness. The scent filled the house with something hearty and homegrown, proof that nothing from the hog ever went to waste. Families who made it knew that the best meals didn't come from the finest cuts. They came from resourceful hands. The flavor was rich, earthy, and satisfying, a balance between the soft potatoes and the chewy, savory casing. It was the kind of food that stuck with you, not just in the belly, but in memory. Hog maw and potatoes was about resilience, about stretching what little you had into something that felt whole. It was shared at big tables after church, on holidays, or any day that called for gratitude. To outsiders, it might have seemed humble, but for those who grew up on it, it tasted like home and history wrapped in one. A meal like this didn't just feed the body, it fed the pride of making plenty out of almost nothing. Pickled watermelon rind turned summer scraps into something bright and memorable when waste was never an option. Families peeled the green rinds from sweet watermelons, cut them into strips, and simmered them in a brine of vinegar, sugar, and warm spices until the pieces turned translucent and tender. The finished pickles carried a gentle sweetness with a tart kick that balanced fried fish or smoky barbecued pork. Children often helped pack the jars, laughing as the kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and clove. These jars lined pantry shelves and cooled in cellars, ready to brighten winter meals with a taste of summer. For many households, this thrifty condiment was a sign of careful planning and pride in making every harvest last. Today, few people bother to save the rinds, and the recipe hides in old notebooks and fading memories. Yet those who remember speak of the surprising pleasure of that sweet, sour crunch beside a plate of fried catfish. Salmon croquettes were the breakfast of ingenuity, born from tin cans and imagination. Canned salmon was mixed with onions, cornmeal, and a bit of egg shaped into patties and fried until crisp. The smell filled the house like a promise that the day would be all right. They were crunchy on the outside, tender inside, and full of flavor that reached far beyond their humble ingredients. The sizzle of the skillet was music, the sound of a meal stretching to feed everyone. Eaten with grits, biscuits, or a little mustard on the side, they turned a simple morning into something memorable. These croquettes were survival disguised as comfort food, proof that scarcity never stopped creativity. They were hearty enough for men heading to work and tasty enough to make children smile. The golden crust caught the light just right, shining like victory in the pan. Salmon croquettes were a triumph of spirit and taste over circumstance. Blackberry molasses cobbler was a sticky, smoky dessert that belonged to cast-iron skillets and long summer nights. The berries were gathered wild from fence lines and hedges, their juice staining fingers and laughter alike. Mixed with thick, dark molasses and a handful of sugar, they turned into a bubbling, fragrant filling. The crust was poured over top, sometimes biscuit dough, sometimes batter, and baked until the edges burned just enough to taste like smoke. It was messy and imperfect, but that was part of its beauty. The syrup thickened into a glossy black glaze that clung to every bite, sweet with a whisper of bitterness. People spooned it hot into bowls, sometimes with milk or cream, but it never needed help. Blackberry molasses cobbler tasted like work and reward, like something earned under the sun. It was the dessert that reminded families that sweetness could survive the hardest days, that joy could bubble up even from thorns. Wild muscadine grape jam brought the late summer woods to the breakfast table in a deep purple shine. Children and parents walked along fence lines and wooded edges with baskets in hand, searching for the thick-skinned grapes that thrived in southern heat. Once gathered, the fruit was boiled gently until the skins burst and the pulp softened, filling kitchens with a fragrance that hinted at honey and earth. The juice was strained and mixed with sugar, then cooked again until it thickened into a jam rich enough to spread over biscuits or stir into morning porridge. Families prized each jar, knowing that muscadines grew wild and free, needing only careful hands and patience to become something sweet. In some towns, church groups organized picking days, turning the harvest into a social event where songs and laughter echoed through the vines. Today, supermarket grapes have replaced the wild hunt, and store-bought jams lack the musky depth of fruit ripened under southern sun. But memories of purple-stained fingers still linger in many hearts. Hominy pancakes were another clever way families stretched resources into filling meals. Hominy, boiled corn kernels treated with lye, was folded into simple flour batter and fried on a hot griddle until crisp on the edges. The result was a pancake that was hearty, chewy, and rich in flavor. Families leaned on this dish because hominy was inexpensive, filling, and often available in bulk. These pancakes were served plain or topped with syrup, molasses, or even just butter when sugar was scarce. Children enjoyed the slightly nutty texture, while adults appreciated that it carried them through long hours of work. Hominy pancakes were tied to heritage too, with roots reaching back to Native American food traditions that influenced Southern cooking. They were a reminder of resilience and cultural continuity, showing how simple staples could be reinvented to meet new needs. Hominy pancakes filled stomachs, but they also filled mornings with the comfort of tradition and the creativity of making do. Grease gravy rice was what people cooked when they refused to let anything go to waste. When breakfast meats were done frying, the leftover grease became treasure. A spoon of flour went in first, sizzling and popping until it turned golden. Then milk or water got poured in, slow and steady, until it thickened into smooth gravy. That hot gravy poured over white rice made something out of nearly nothing. It was salty, creamy, and smoky all at once. The smell filled the house and the taste filled the stomach. Parents called it breakfast, but it could carry a family through an entire day. It came from kitchens that knew survival like a second language, where flavor was earned from thrift and patience. Kids grew up thinking it was comfort food, not knowing it was born from rationing and struggle. Grease gravy rice was more than a recipe. It was a declaration that no meal was too small to matter. Every bite was a promise that the family would eat, even when times were lean. It was humble food that carried pride on a spoon. Leftover grit cakes turned yesterday's breakfast into today's miracle. When the morning rush was over and the pot of grit sat cold, mothers would scoop what was left into a pan, chill it, then slice it thick by dawn. Those slices were fried in bacon grease until crisp outside and tender within. What started as thrift became tradition, proof that waste had no place in a careful home. Served with eggs or syrup, grit cakes were hearty, filling, and familiar. Their golden crust and soft middle carried the taste of patience and practicality. No one complained about eating them again. In fact, most looked forward to it. They were the kind of food that spoke softly of care, of making something new without needing anything extra. Even the smell of frying grits could bring everyone to the table fast. Leftover grit cakes were a reminder that the best meals are often the simplest ones, built from what was already enough. Fried fatback and biscuits were the workers' feast, the kind of meal that tasted like a well-earned rest. Strips of salted fatback were fried until they turned crisp and golden, their grease saved to brush over hot biscuits straight from the oven. The smell alone was enough to lift tired spirits after long days in the field or factory. The biscuits, tender and flaky, soaked up the salty richness until every bite melted together in perfect balance. It wasn't fancy, but it was fulfilling, the kind of food that made a person feel whole again. Children would fight over the last piece while parents smiled, knowing there was pride in providing something so simple yet satisfying. Fried fatback and biscuits told a story of work, faith, and endurance, where flavor was wrung from every bit of effort. It was a reminder that food didn't need luxury to carry love. Each bite crackled with warmth and memory, proof that comfort could be built from the humblest pantry. Fried fatback and biscuits were more than breakfast. They were a quiet victory on every plate. Fried green tomatoes were born from gardens that didn't wait for ripeness. When the first chill of the season came, folks picked what was left and turned those hard, tart fruits into something golden. Each slice was dipped in cornmeal, salt, and maybe a pinch of cayenne before hitting the hot oil. The sizzle filled the kitchen with anticipation, and soon the edges browned into crispy perfection. The result was tangy, crunchy, and bright, a surprise of flavor from something most would toss aside. Fried green tomatoes weren't wasteful. They were wise. They showed how ingenuity could turn limitation into delight. Families ate them hot, sometimes with gravy or between slices of bread, savoring the mix of sour and savor. They were the taste of transition, of seasons changing and hands adapting. In every crisp bite was a lesson passed down quietly. Nothing should go unused, and patience is a form of love. Fried green tomatoes may have started as necessity, but they ended as Southern tradition, proof that creativity could turn the unripe into the unforgettable. Homemade chow chow relish added brightness and crunch to plates crowded with greens, beans, and smoked meats. Cabbage, onions, peppers, and green tomatoes were chopped fine and simmered with vinegar, mustard seed, and sugar until they formed a tangy condiment that could last through winter. Every household had a slightly different recipe, some sweeter, some hotter, each a reflection of the cook's own hand. The relish brought sharp contrast to rich dishes like pork shoulder or pinto beans, cutting through heaviness with a lively bite. In late summer, neighbors gathered to chop vegetables together, sharing stories as big pots bubbled on outdoor fires. Jars lined pantry shelves in rows of glowing gold and green, a promise of flavor when fresh produce was long gone. Over time, store-bought pickles and bottled sauces replaced the careful preparation of chow chow, but its memory endures wherever families recall the sound of knives on wooden boards and the reward of a bright spoonful alongside a hearty meal. Hot cakes from scratch were the kind of breakfast that filled both plate and spirit. Made with buttermilk, flour, and a spoon of bacon grease, they sizzled on iron skillets until golden brown. The edges turned crisp, while the centers stayed soft and airy. These pancakes carried the smell of warmth, salt, and home. Syrup was a treat, but butter or molasses worked just as well. Children would line up with plates in hand, waiting for the next stack. Every flip of the spatula felt like love served hot. They were meals made from what was on hand, never fancy, always right. The bacon grease gave them flavor that stayed with you long after breakfast ended. Families gathered close, laughter mixing with the sound of frying batter. Hot cakes from scratch were not about abundance. They were about comfort built from what you had, made perfect with care. Corn husk pudding was dessert for those who knew how to make the earth sweet. Fresh corn was grated by hand until the bowl filled with golden pulp, then mixed with butter, brown sugar, and milk. The batter was spooned into husks and tied with twine before being steamed until tender. When peeled open, the pudding glowed with a soft yellow shine, smelling of sugar and summer air. Its texture was smooth, its flavor deep and gentle. Families made it for celebrations or simply to remember happier days. It was the kind of sweetness that did not rush, a joy built slowly over a simmering pot. The husks were more than wrappers. They were vessels of gratitude, holding together flavor, memory, and time. Each bite tasted like sunshine, patience, and the steady hands that never stopped creating beauty from simplicity. Corn husk pudding was proof that sweetness does not need gold or cream, only the wisdom to cherish what you already have. It was the song of Southern kitchens, tender and enduring. Green tomato pie was proof that waste was never an option. When frost threatened to ruin the last of the garden, cooks gathered firm, unripe tomatoes and treated them like fruit. Sliced thin and tossed with sugar, cinnamon, and a touch of vinegar, they baked into a pie that looked strange but tasted like revelation. The tartness of the tomatoes balanced beautifully against the spice, creating a dessert both unexpected and irresistible. Green tomato pie turned survival into surprise, using what was left to make what was loved. Families served it proudly, knowing it told a story of ingenuity and heart. It was the kind of recipe whispered between neighbors, passed down without written words, but with quiet reverence. The first bite confused the tongue, part apple, part citrus, all comfort. It was a lesson in gratitude and creativity, a reminder that scarcity could still yield wonder. Green tomato pie was the art of making do and doing it beautifully. Potato candy may sound unusual, but it was once a beloved treat in African American households. Mashed potatoes were combined with powdered sugar until they formed a pliable dough. This mixture was then rolled out and spread with peanut butter before being rolled into logs and sliced into pinwheels. The candy was inexpensive to make and required no fancy ingredients, making it popular during lean times. Its flavor was surprisingly delightful, with the sweetness of sugar balanced by the richness of peanut butter. Children especially loved potato candy because it looked fun and felt like a reward even when resources were limited. It became a common recipe at holidays or family gatherings, where a plate of colorful slices stood proudly on the table. Though it may sound odd today, the candy was a testament to creativity and the ability to transform basic foods into something special. Potato candy was proof that ingenuity in the kitchen could create joy out of scarcity. While it is rarely made now, it remains one of those quirky and unforgettable recipes tied to heritage, memory, and the resourceful spirit of past generations. Buttermilk pound cake was the smell that pulled every child from the yard and every grown man from his nap. Dense, buttery, and baked golden in a bundt pan, it was the dessert that never needed frosting to impress. Mama would pour the batter thick and smooth, humming to herself as she scraped the bowl clean. The scent filled the whole house long before the timer rang, and by the time it came out, the crust had turned just crisp enough to flake under your fingers. The inside stayed moist, soft, and rich, melting on the tongue like memory itself. It was sliced thin for company, thick for family, and never served without a smile. No matter the occasion, Sunday supper, a homecoming, or a neighbor's visit, there was always room for pound cake. The sweetness was steady, never loud, and that was what made it special. It was love baked slow and simple, using what the pantry offered and nothing more. You did not need icing when your heart was already full. Every crumb tasted like care, and the smell lingered long after the plates were washed. Buttermilk pound cake was more than dessert. It was the promise that home was always warm. Peach cobbler with biscuit crust was the kind of dessert that announced itself before you ever saw it. The smell of bubbling peaches thickened with sugar, and butter floated through the air, wrapping around you like a hug after church. Mamas would drop spoonfuls of biscuit dough across the top, never too perfect, always just right. In the oven, it browned into golden peaks that cracked open to reveal syrup thick as honey. Served hot from the skillet, it hissed when the first spoon cut through, juices pooling under the crust. Vanilla ice cream on top was optional, but nobody ever said no. This was the dessert that could turn silence into praise and leftovers into legend. You could taste the sunshine in every bite, sweet from the fruit, warm from the oven, and rich from the hand that stirred it. Peach cobbler carried the spirit of summer even in winter, reminding everyone that joy was meant to be shared. It was messy, sticky, and absolutely perfect. Proof that flavor came from feeling, not fancy tools. Turkey necks and rice gravy made sure no part of the bird went to waste. Once the holiday turkey had been carved, the necks were simmered down with onions, celery, and a touch of flour until the broth thickened into a dark, flavorful gravy. Poured over rice, it became a meal in itself, simple, filling, and rich with comfort. The meat from the necks was tender, sliding off the bone like butter, and the gravy carried every bit of the bird's essence. In many homes, this dish was the quiet favorite, eaten the day after the feast, when the celebration slowed but the warmth remained. It was food for resting hearts and tired hands, the kind that made you close your eyes after a long meal. Turkey necks and rice gravy turned leftovers into love, teaching that nothing was ever too small to be savored. Creamed peas on toast was the quiet triumph of the Thrifty kitchen, where love turned scarcity into satisfaction. When meat ran out, mothers reached for canned peas, butter, and a little flour to make magic happen. The butter melted into the pan, bubbling with the promise of warmth, and a spoonful of flour thickened it into a creamy roux. A splash of milk turned everything smooth and velvety, coating each green pea in a blanket of comfort. The toast, simple white bread browned on a pan or in the oven, waited like a canvas for the sauce to spill across it. The smell was gentle, buttery, and sweet, the kind that made a house feel like home. It was a meal made in minutes but remembered for years. Families sat together at small tables, passing plates with gratitude and quiet joy. It was humble, yes, but never empty. It fed both hunger and hope. Creamed peas on toast was more than a supper. It was a reminder that gentleness in cooking could make even the hardest days feel soft again. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth were the type of dish that felt simple but filling, carrying both thrift and comfort in every bowl. The broth began with canned or fresh tomatoes, cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of seasoning to build a savory base. My grandmother mixed cornmeal with a bit of flour, salt, and water to form small dumplings, dropping them carefully into the bubbling pot. As they simmered, the dumplings softened into tender bites, soaking up the tang of the tomatoes while thickening the stew. The smell alone brought everyone to the kitchen, the blend of corn and tomato promising something hearty without needing meat. Cornmeal was cheap and always on hand, a staple in Black households across the South. Tomato broth was inexpensive too, whether from garden harvests or canned goods bought in bulk. Together, they created a meal that cost next to nothing but filled hungry stomachs with warmth. Cornmeal dumplings in tomato broth turned two of the humblest ingredients into a family staple, proving that frugality and care could produce meals worth remembering. Chitterlings, known lovingly as chitlins, were not for the faint of heart, but for those who knew the value of patience and pride. These were the cleaned and boiled intestines of the hog, cooked down for hours until tender and fragrant. What some saw as scraps, others turned into delicacy, a meal shared on holidays to honor endurance itself. Preparing chitlins was an act of devotion, from the endless washing to the slow simmer with onions, vinegar, and spice. They filled homes with a smell that spoke of both hardship and heritage, a reminder that survival had its own flavor. Served with hot sauce and cornbread, they were more than food. They were history in a pot. On Christmas tables across the South, chitlins weren't just eaten, they were respected, a symbol of making beauty from what others cast aside. Rice and gravy supper was simplicity perfected, the kind of dinner that proved luxury had nothing to do with money. A pot of soft, steaming rice sat waiting while the skillet worked its magic. The gravy began with drippings, saved from fried chicken, pork chops, or even a Sunday roast, scraped and stirred with a wooden spoon until the bits lifted and melted into flavor. Flour and water followed, thickening it just enough to coat the back of a spoon, and then came the pepper, plenty of it. When that golden brown gravy was ladled over rice, it turned humble grains into something rich and deeply comforting. Families gathered around the table, their worries melting away with every bite. It was food that filled more than bellies. It filled the soul with calm. Even without meat, it carried the taste of patience and love, proof that a single pan and a few ingredients could build a feast. Sweet corn and onion skillet was the kind of dish that came together quickly, made from what the garden and pantry had to offer. Fresh ears of corn, or sometimes canned when the season had passed, were sliced from the cob and tossed into a hot pan with sliced onions. Lard or bacon fat did the work of bringing flavor, sizzling until the onions browned and the corn caramelized. The smell was sweet and smoky, filling the house with a promise of comfort even before the first bite. It was cheap, it was fast, and it was nourishing, the kind of supper that stretched across countless families trying to make ends meet. My grandmother served it with bread or cornbread, letting the skillet's juices soak into every bite. The simplicity was its strength, just vegetables and fat, transformed into something more than the sum of its parts. Sweet corn and onion skillet reminded everyone that even with little, you could still eat well. Cornbread dressing with giblets was proof that nothing in a black mother's kitchen ever went to waste. Leftover cornbread became the soul of the dish, crumbled, seasoned, and mixed with onions, celery, and a broth made from the chicken or turkey itself. Giblets, once tossed aside by others, were chopped and stirred in for richness. The smell alone could make you stop mid-conversation, earthy and herby, with sage and butter filling the air. Every household had its version, some soft like pudding, others crisp on the edges from the oven's heat. It was a dish that stretched ingredients and stretched hearts, feeding a crowd on a small budget. Mothers made it with one hand stirring the pot and the other wiping a child's face, knowing that love didn't need wealth, it needed wisdom. Cornbread dressing tasted like abundance born out of frugality, like the magic of turning little into plenty. It wasn't just food, it was history baked golden in a pan. Stewed chicken backs were one of those meals that turned scraps into sustenance. In the 1960s, the back of the chicken was considered the cheapest cut, with little meat clinging to the bones. My grandmother bought them in bulk, cleaned them, and simmered them for hours with onions, potatoes, and carrots until the broth grew rich and fragrant. The long cooking softened the bits of meat so they slid easily from the bones, creating a meal that was both filling and flavorful. Families served the stew over rice or with cornbread, stretching the broth even further. The dish carried smoky undertones if she added a ham bone or a splash of fatback, but it was nourishing even without extras. What made it memorable was how something so overlooked could still feel satisfying and dignified at the table. Stewed chicken backs reminded families that nothing should be wasted, and even the smallest scraps could anchor a full dinner. It was a meal of patience, thrift, and creativity, proof that the cheapest part of the bird could still feed a household with warmth and pride. Vegetable soup from kitchen scraps was pure genius born from necessity, a pot of everything and nothing all at once. Every peel, every end, every leftover carrot, potato, or onion found its way into the bubbling broth. Grandparents saved the bones from roasts, the wilted greens from salads, even a handful of noodles if there were some left behind. Those scraps met in the pot and became something far greater than the sum of their parts. The broth deepened in color and flavor with every passing hour, carrying the scent of care through the house. It was food that took time, that demanded patience, that rewarded frugality with comfort. The wooden spoon stirred slowly, pulling stories from the pot like memories rising with the steam. Kids waited, bowls in hand, as the kitchen fogged with warmth. Each bite tasted like love stretched thin but never broken. Nothing was wasted. Not time, not flavor, not effort. It was a reminder that even small things, when treated with respect, could become something beautiful. Vegetable soup was a testament to endurance, to gratitude, and to the art of making enough out of almost nothing. Molasses candied yams were sweetened by patience, not plenty. When refined sugar was too dear, families reached for homemade molasses or sorghum syrup to coat slices of sweet potato until they glistened like amber. The yams simmered slow in cast-iron skillets, bubbling under a glaze that filled the kitchen with a smell deep as memory. They were tender, caramelized at the edges, and sticky enough to make every bite feel like dessert and blessing at once. Molasses brought something that sugar never could, a smoky sweetness that felt ancient, earthy, and whole. These yams were served alongside meat if there was any, or eaten plain from a spoon when there wasn't. They were comfort, made from soil and struggle alike, proof that sweetness could be drawn from even the hardest ground. In every spoonful was history cooked down to syrup and flame. Cornbread and beans was the supper of survivors, the backbone of countless working families who knew how to turn little into plenty. The beans simmered low and slow, soaking up every bit of flavor from scraps of onion, bacon, or a precious ham bone saved from Sunday dinner. The longer they cooked, the richer they became, filling the home with a deep, savory scent that promised satisfaction. Cornbread baked nearby, its golden crust rising in the oven, the smell of butter and cornmeal mixing perfectly with the aroma of beans on the stove. When dinner was ready, families gathered close, crumbling the cornbread right into their bowls to soak up the thick broth. It wasn't just filling, it was fulfilling, warming both the body and the spirit. Some families added vinegar, others sprinkled sugar, but every household had its way of making it just right. Cornbread and beans told a story of endurance and community, of hard hands and full hearts. It wasn't luxury, it was life, steady and sustaining, passed from one generation to the next as a lesson in gratitude and grace. It reminded everyone that love, like good beans, only grows stronger the longer it's tended. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was a clever twist on an old classic that fit the budget of Black families in the 1960s. Instead of pricey white potatoes, sweet potatoes from the garden were boiled, mashed, and spread on top of a filling made from scraps of meat and vegetables. My grandmother would use whatever was left, bits of beef, chicken, or even pork, chopped small and cooked with onions, carrots, or peas until it formed a savory base. The sweet potato topping baked into a golden layer that balanced the salty meat with a touch of natural sweetness. It was hearty enough to fill everyone, but cheap enough to make even during lean weeks. Sweet potatoes were plentiful in many southern gardens, and they stretched farther than most vegetables because they were filling and rich in flavor. Shepherd's pie with mashed sweet potatoes was more than just food. It was a statement of ingenuity. Families made do with what they had and still put something warm and comforting on the table. That golden crust represented thrift and care, carrying both survival and love in every spoonful. Molasses stack cake was the Christmas centerpiece that grew layer by layer, built not from luxury, but from love and labor. Each thin, golden brown cake was baked separately, its surface brushed with warm molasses or sorghum syrup before another layer was carefully added on top. When finished, it stood tall and proud, heavy with sweetness and meaning. Then came the hardest part, waiting. For several days, the cake sat wrapped and resting, the syrup slowly soaking into every layer until the texture turned moist and tender, the flavors deepened, and time itself became an ingredient. Navy bean and ham bone soup was the meal that turned leftovers into legend, a dish that spoke of slow hours and full hearts. The leftover ham bone from Sunday's meal went into a big pot with dry beans, onions, and water, and from that, magic was born. It simmered for hours until the beans softened and the meat slipped from the bone. The broth turned smoky, thick, and fragrant, filling the air with a scent that could stop conversation mid-sentence. Each spoonful carried history of thrift, care, and kitchens that knew patience by name. Sometimes carrots or celery were added if the garden gave enough. Other times, it was just beans and hope. The soup was ladled into mismatched bowls, steaming and hearty, the kind of meal that made even a cold house feel warm. Every bite tasted like effort made worthwhile, like gratitude turned into nourishment. It was proof that love, when simmered slowly, could feed a family for days. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were the kind of dinner that showed how families found sweetness even in struggle. Sorghum syrup, cheaper than sugar, was kept in jars that seemed to last forever, poured generously over hot biscuits fresh from the oven. My grandmother baked the biscuits with flour and lard, ingredients that could be stretched and shared across multiple meals. Once the biscuits were ready, She split them open, drizzled them with syrup, and served them with cold milk poured into glasses. It was simple but filling, providing enough energy for tired workers and growing children. The sweetness of the syrup turned plain flour biscuits into something that felt like a treat, even if it was just supper. In the 1960s, this kind of meal reminded families that comfort did not always need meat or elaborate dishes. It was about making do with what was on hand and finding joy in it. Sorghum syrup biscuits with milk were a reminder that sweetness could soften the edge of hardship. The last bite always tasted like gratitude, the kind that lingers long after the bowl's been scraped clean. One spoonful, and the whole world slowed down. If these dishes brought back memories of your mama's kitchen or made you hungry for the past, share your favorite in the comments, give this video a like, and subscribe so we can keep serving up stories that taste just like home.